Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. So, wildlings, of all this, the contempt for the world and for each other, the belief in one's own transcendent superiority, the betrayal of those that love you, and all the horrible things done, as all roads do, all of it leads to the same place. As it happens, it's a place that our players are not going to like. Tonight's terrible telling, the finale of The Hellbound Heart, by horror hierophant Clive Barker. She woke in a blizzard, or such was her first impression. Above her a perfect whiteness, snow on snow. She tucked up in snow, pillowed in snow. The blankness was sickening. It seemed to fill up her throat and eyes. She raised her hands in front of her face. They smelled of an unfamiliar soap whose perfume was harsh. Now she began to focus. The walls, the pristine sheets, the medication beside the bed. A hospital. She called out for help. Hours or minutes later, she wasn't sure which, it came in the form of a nurse who simply said, "You're awake," and went to fetch her superiors. She told them nothing when they came. She had decided in the time between the nurse's disappearance and reappearance with the doctors that this was not a story that she was ready to tell. Tomorrow, maybe, she might find the words to convince them of what she'd seen, but today, if she tried to explain, they would stroke her brow and tell her to hush her nonsense, condescend to her, and tried to persuade her that she was hallucinating. If she pressed the point, they'd probably sedate her, which would, of course, make matters worse. What she needed was time to think. All of this she'd worked out before they'd arrived, so that when they asked her what had happened, she had her lies ready. It was all a fog, she told them. She could barely remember her own name. "It'll come back in time," they reassured her, and she replied meekly that she supposed it would. "Sleep now," they said, and she told them that she would be happy to do just that, and yawned. They withdrew then. "Oh, yes," one of them said as he was about to go. "I forgot." He brought Frank's box from his pocket. "You were holding on to this," he said, "when you were found. We had the devil's own job getting it out of your hand. Does it mean anything to you?" She said that it didn't. "The police have looked at it. There was blood on it, you see. Maybe yours, maybe not." He approached the bed. "Do you want it?" he asked her, then added, "It's been cleaned." "Yes," she replied. "Yes, please. It may jog your memory," he told her, and put it down on the bedside table. "What are we going to do?" Julia demanded for the 100th time. The man in the corner said nothing, nor was there any interpretable sign on his ruin of a face. "What did you want with her anyway?" she asked him. "You've spoiled everything." "Spoiled," said the monster. "You don't know the meaning of spoiled." She swallowed her anger. His brooding unnerved her. "We have to leave, Frank," she said, softening her tone. He threw a look across at her, white-hot. "They'll come looking," she said. "She'll tell them everything." "Maybe." "Don't you care?" she demanded. The bandage-lumped shrugged. "Yes," he said, "of course. But we can't leave, sweetheart." Sweetheart. The word mocked them both, a breath of sentiment in a room that had known only pain. "I can't face the world like this," he gestured to his face. "Can I?" he said, staring up at her. "Look at me!" She looked. "Can I?" "No." "No!" He went back to perusing the floor. "I need a skin, Julia." "A skin? Then, maybe we can go dancing together. Isn't that what you want?" He spoke of both dancing and death with equal nonchalance, as though one carried as little significance as the other. It calmed her hearing him talk that way. "How?" she said at last, meaning how can a skin be stolen, but also how will our sanity survive? "There are ways," said the flayed face, and blew her a kiss. Had it not been for the white walls, she might never have picked up the box. Had there been a picture to look at, vase of sunflowers or a view of pyramids, anything to break the monotony of the room, she would have been content to stare at it and think. But the blankness was too much. It gave her no handhold on sanity. So she reached across to the table beside the bed and picked up the box. It was heavier than she remembered. She had to sit up in bed to examine it. There was little enough to see. No lid that she could find, no keyhole, no hinges. If she turned it over once, she had turned it over 100 times, finding no clue to how it might be opened. It was not solid, she was certain of that, so logic demanded that there be a way into it. But where? She tapped it, shook it, pulled it, and pressed it, all without result. It was not until she rolled over in bed and examined it in the full glare of the lamp that she discovered some clue as to how the box was constructed. There were infinitesimal cracks in the sides of the box where one piece of the puzzle abutted the next. They would have been invisible but that a residue of blood remained in them, tracing the complex relation of the parts. Systematically, she began to feel her way over the sides, testing her hypothesis by pushing and pulling once more. The cracks offered her a general geography of the toy. Without them, she might have wandered the 6 sides forever. But the options were significantly reduced by the clues that she'd found. There were only so many ways that the box could be made to come apart. After a time, her patience was rewarded. A click, and suddenly one of the compartments was sliding out from beside its lacquered neighbors. Within, there was beauty, polished surfaces which scintillated like the finest mother of pearl, colored shadows seeming to move in the gloss. And there was music, too. A simple tune emerged from the box, played on a mechanism that she could not yet see. Enchanted, she delved further. Though one piece had been removed, the rest did not come readily. Each segment presented a fresh challenge to fingers and mind, the victories rewarded with a further filigree added to the tune. She was coaxing the 4th section out by an elaborate series of turns and counter-turns when she heard the bell. She stopped working and looked up. Something was wrong. Either her weary eyes were playing tricks, or the blizzard white walls had moved subtly out of true. She put down the box and slipped out of bed to go to the window. The bell still rang, a solemn tolling. She drew back the curtain a few inches. It was night and windy. Leaves migrated across the hospital lawn. Moths congregated in the lamplight. Unlikely as it seemed, the sound of the bell wasn't coming from outside. It was beside her. She let the curtain drop and turned back into the room. As she did so, the bulb in the bedside light glittered like a living flame. Instinctively, she reached for the pieces of the box. They and these strange events were intertwined somehow, she knew. As her hand found the fragments, the light blew out. She was not left in darkness, however, nor was she alone. There was a soft phosphorescence at the end of the bed, and in its folds, a figure. The condition of its flesh beggared her imagination, the hooks, the scars, yet its voice, when it spoke, was not that of a creature in pain. "It's called the Le Marchand configuration," it said, pointing at the box. She looked down. The pieces were no longer in her hand, but floating inches above her palm. Miraculously, the box was reassembling itself without visible aid, the pieces sliding back together as the whole construction turned over and over. As it did so, she caught fresh glimpses of the polished interior, and seemed to see ghosts' faces, twisted as if by grief or bad glass, howling back at her. Then, all but one of the segments was sealed up, and the visitor claimed her attention afresh. "The box is a means to break the surface of the real," it said. "A kind of invocation by which we Cenobites can be notified." "Who?" she said. "Oh, you did it in ignorance," the visitor said. "Am I right?" "Yes." "It's happened before," came the reply. "But there's no help for it. No way to seal the schism until we take what's ours." "This is a mistake," she said. "Now, don't try to fight. It's quite beyond your control. You have to accompany me." She shook her head. She'd had enough of bullying nightmares to last her a lifetime. "No, I won't go with you. Damn you, I won't." As she spoke, the door opened. A nurse she didn't recognize, a member of the night shift presumably, was standing there. "Did you call out?" she asked. Kirsty looked at the Cenobite, then back at the nurse. They stood no more than a yard apart. "She doesn't see me," it told her, "nor does she hear me. I belong to you, Kirsty, and you to me." "No," she said. "Are you sure?" said the nurse. "I thought I heard..." Kirsty shook her head. "It was lunacy. All of it. Lunacy." "You should be in bed," the nurse chided. "You'll catch your death." The Cenobite tittered. "I'll be back in 5 minutes," said the nurse. "Please, go back to sleep." And then she was gone again. "We'd better go," it said. "Leave them to their patchwork, huh? Such depressing places." "You can't do this," she insisted. It moved toward her nevertheless. A row of tiny bells depending from the scraggy flesh of its neck tinkled as it approached. The stink it gave off made her want to heave. "Wait." "No. No tears, please. It's a waste of good suffering." "The box," she said in desperation. "Don't you want to know where I got the box?" "Not particularly." "Frank Cotton," she said. "Does that name mean anything to you? Frank Cotton?" The Cenobite smiled. "Oh, yes. We know Frank." "He solved the box too, am I right?" He wanted pleasure, until we gave it to him. Then he squirmed." "If I took you to him..." "Oh, he's alive then?" "Very much alive." "And you're proposing what? That I take him back instead of you?" "Yes. Yes, why not? Yes." The Cenobite moved away from her, and the room sighed. I'm tempted," it said. Then, "But perhaps you're cheating me. Perhaps this is a lie to buy you time." "I know where he is, for God's sake," she said. "He did this to me." She presented her slashed arms for its perusal. "If you're lying," it said, "if you're trying to squirm your way out of this..." "I'm not." "Deliver him alive to us, then." She wanted to weep with relief. "Make him confess himself, and maybe we won't tear your soul apart." Rory stood in the hallway and stared at Julia, his Julia, the woman that he had once sworn to have and to hold till death did them part. It had not seemed such a difficult promise to keep at the time. He had idolized her for as long as he could remember, dreaming of her by night and spending the days composing love poems of wild ineptitude to her. But things had changed. And he had learned, as he watched them change, that the greatest torments were often the subtlest. There had been times of late when he would have preferred a death by wild horses to the itch of suspicion that had so degraded his joy. Now, as he looked at her standing at the bottom of the stairs, it was impossible for him to even remember how good things had once been. All was doubt and dirt. One of the things he was glad of, she looked troubled. Maybe that meant that there was a confession in the air, indiscretions that she would pour out, and that he would forgive her for in a welter of tears and understanding. "You look sad," he said. She hesitated, then said, "It's difficult, Rory." "What is?" She seemed to want to give up before she began. "What is?" he pressed. "I've so much to tell you." Her hand, he saw, was grasping the banister so tightly that the knuckles burned white. "I'm listening," he said. He would love her again if she would just be honest with him. "Tell me," he said. "I think maybe it would be easier if I showed you," she told him, and so saying, she led him upstairs. The wind that harried the streets was not warm, to judge by the way the pedestrians drew their collars up and their faces down, but Kirsty didn't feel the chill. Was it her invisible companion who kept the cold from her, cloaking her with the fire that the ancients had conjured to burn sinners in? Either that or she was too frightened to feel anything. But then, that wasn't how she felt either. She wasn't actually frightened. The feeling in her gut was far more ambiguous. She had opened a door, the same door that Rory's brother had opened, and now she was walking with demons. And at the end of her travels, she would have her revenge. She would find the thing that had torn her and tormented her and make him feel the powerlessness that she had suffered. She would watch him squirm. More than that, she would enjoy it. Pain had made a sadist of her. As she made her way along Lodovico Street, she looked round for a sign of the Cenobite, but he was nowhere to be seen. Undaunted, she approached the house. She had no plan in mind. There were too many variables to be juggled. For one, would Julia be there? And if so, how involved in all of this was she? It was impossible to believe that she could be an innocent bystander, but perhaps she had acted out of terror of Frank. The next few minutes might furnish the answers. She rang the bell and waited. The door was answered by Julia, in her hand a length of white lace. "Kirsty," she said, apparently unfazed by her appearance. "It's late." "Where's Rory?" were Kirsty's first words. They hadn't been quite what she had intended, but they came out unbidden. "He's here," Julia replied calmly, as if soothing a manic child. "Is there something wrong?" "I'd like to see him," Kirsty answered. "Rory?" "Yes." She stepped over the threshold without waiting for an invitation. Julia made no objection, but closed the door behind her. Only now did Kirsty feel the chill. She stood in the hallway and shivered. "You look terrible," said Julia plainly. "I was here this afternoon," she blurted. "I saw what happened, Julia. I saw." "What was there to see?" came the reply. Her poise was unassailed. "You know." "Truly, I don't." "I want to speak to Rory." "Well, of course," came the reply. "But take care with him, will you? He's not feeling very well." She led Kirsty through into the dining room. Rory was sitting at the table. There was a glass of spirits in his hand, a bottle beside it. Laid across the adjacent chair was Julia's wedding dress. The sight of it prompted recognition of the lace swath in her hand. It was the bridal veil. Rory looked much the worse for wear. There was dried blood on his face and at his hairline. The smile he offered was warm, but fatigued. "What happened?" she asked him. "It's all right now, Kirsty," he said, his voice barely aspired to a whisper. "Julia told me everything, and it's all right." "No," she said, knowing that he couldn't possibly have the whole story. You came here this afternoon. That's right. That was unfortunate. But you asked me... She glanced at Julia, who was standing at the door, then back at Rory. I did what I thought you wanted. Yes, I know. I'm only sorry that you were dragged into this terrible business. You know what your brother's done? She said. You know what he summoned? I know enough, Rory replied. The point is, it's over now. What do you mean? Whatever he did to you, I'll make amends. What do you mean, over? He's dead, Kirsty. Deliver him alive, and maybe we won't tear your soul apart. Dead? We destroyed him, Julia and I. It wasn't so difficult. He thought he could trust me, you see, thought that blood was thicker than water. Well, it isn't. I wouldn't suffer a man like that to live. She felt something twitch in her belly. Had the Cenobites got their hooks into her already, snagging the carpet of her bowels? You've been so kind, Kirsty, risking so much, coming back here. There was something at her shoulder. Give me your souls, it said. I'll go to the authorities when I feel a little stronger. Try and find a way to make them understand. You killed him, she said. Yes. I don't believe it, she muttered. Take her upstairs, Rory said to Julia. Show her. You want to see? Julia inquired. Kirsty nodded and followed. It was warmer on the landing than it was below, and the air was greasy and grey like filthy dishwater. The door to Frank's room was ajar. The thing that lay on the bare boards in a tangle of torn bandaging still steamed. His neck was clearly broken, head askew on his shoulders. He was devoid of skin from head to foot. Kirsty looked away, nauseated. Satisfied? Julia asked. Kirsty didn't reply, but left the room and stepped onto the landing. At her shoulder the air was restless. You lost, something said close by her. I know, she murmured. The bell had begun to ring again, tolling for her, surely, and a turmoil of wings nearby, a carnival of carrion birds. She hurried down the stairs, praying that she wouldn't be overtaken before she reached the door. If they tore her heart out, let Rory be spared the sight. Let him remember her strong, with laughter on her lips, not please. Beside her, Julia said, Where are you going? When there was no reply forthcoming, she went on talking. Don't say anything to anybody, Kirsty, she insisted. We can deal with this, Rory and me. Her voice had stirred Rory from his drink. He appeared in the hallway. The wounds Frank had inflicted looked more severe than Kirsty had first thought. His face was bruised in a dozen places, and the skin at his neck ploughed up. As she came abreast of him, he reached out and took her arm. Julia's right, he said. Leave it to us to report, will you? There were so many things that she wanted to tell him at that moment, but time left room for none. The bell was getting louder in her head. Someone had looped their entrails around her neck and was pulling the knot tight. It's too late, she murmured to Rory and pressed his hand away. What do you mean? He said to her as she covered the yards to the door. Don't go, Kirsty, not yet. Tell me what you mean. She couldn't help but offer him a backward glance, hoping that he would find in her face all the regrets she felt. It's all right, he said sweetly, still hoping to heal her. Really, it is. He opened his arms. Come to Daddy, he said. The phrase didn't sound right out of Rory's mouth. Some boys never grew to be daddies, however many children they sired. Kirsty put out a hand to the wall to steady herself. It wasn't Rory who was speaking to her. It was Frank. Somehow, it was Frank. She held on to the thought through the She held on to the thought through the morning din of bells, so loud now that her skull seemed ready to crack open. Rory was still smiling at her, arms extended. He was talking, too, but she could no longer hear what he said. The tender flesh of his face shaped the words, but the bells drowned them out. She was thankful for that fact. It made it easier to defy the evidence of her eyes. "I know who you are," she said suddenly, and not certain of whether her words were audible or not, but unquenchably sure that they were true. Rory's corpse was upstairs, left to lie in Frank's shunned bandaging. The usurped skin was now wed to his brother's body, the marriage sealed with the letting of blood. Yes, that was it. The coils around her throat were tightening. It could only be moments before they dragged her off. In desperation, she started back along the hallway toward the thing in Rory's face. "It's you," she said. The smile... The face still smiled at her, undismayed. She reached out and snatched at him. Startled, he took a step backward to avoid her touch, moving with graceful sloth, but somehow still managing to avoid her touch. The bells were intolerable. They were pulping her thoughts, tolling her brain tissue to dust. At the rim of her sanity, she reached again for him, and this time he did not quite avoid her. Her nails raked the flesh of his cheek, and the skin, so recently grafted, slid away like silk. The blood-buttered meat beneath came into horrid view, and behind her, Julia screamed. Suddenly the bells weren't in Kirsty's head any longer. They were in the house, in the world. The hallway lights burned dazzlingly bright, then, their filaments overloading, went out. There was a short period of total darkness during which time she heard a whimpering that may or may not have come from her own lips. Then it was as if fireworks were spluttering into life in the walls and floor. The hallway danced, one moment an abattoir, walls running scarlet, the next a boudoir, powder blue, canary yellow. The moment following that, a ghost train tunnel, all speed and sudden fire. By one flaring light she saw Frank moving toward her, Rory's discarded face hanging from his jaw. She avoided his outstretched arm and ducked through into the front room. The hold on her throat relaxed. She realized the Cenobites had apparently seen the error of her ways. Soon they would intervene, surely, and bring an end to this farce of mistaken identities. She would not wait to see Frank claimed as she thought of doing. She had had enough. Instead, she'd flee the house by the back door and leave them to it. Her optimism was short-lived. The fireworks in the hall threw some light ahead of her into the dining room, enough to see that it was already bewitched. There was something moving over the floor, like ash before a wind, and chains cavorting in the air. Innocent she might be, but the forces loose here were indifferent to such trivialities. She sensed that to take another step would invite atrocities. Her hesitation put her back within Frank's reach, but as he snatched at her, the fireworks in the hallway faltered, and she slipped away from him under cover of darkness. This respite was all too brief, however. New lights were already blooming in the hall, and he was after her afresh, blocking her route to the front door. Why didn't they claim him, for God's sake? Hadn't she brought him there as she'd promised, and unmasked him? Frank opened his jacket. In his belt was a bloodied knife, doubtless the flaying edge. He pulled it out and pointed it at Kirsty. "From now on," he said as he stalked her, "I'm Rory." She had no choice but to back away from him, the door, escape, sanity receding with every step. "Understand me? I'm Rory now, and nobody's ever going to know any better." Her heel hit the bottom of the stair, and suddenly there were other hands on her, reaching through the banisters and seizing fistfuls of her hair. She twisted her head round and looked up. It was Julia, of course, face slack, all passion consumed. She wrenched Kirsty's head back, exposing her throat as Frank's knife gleamed toward it. At the last moment, Kirsty reached up above her head and snatched a hold of Julia's arm, wrenching her from her perch on the third or fourth stair. Losing both her balance and her grip on her victim, Julia let out a shout and fell, her body coming between Kirsty and Frank's thrust. The blade was too close to be avoided. It entered Julia's side to the hilt. She moaned, then reeled away down the hall, the knife buried in her. Frank scarcely seemed to notice. His eyes were on Kirsty once again, and they shone with horrendous appetite. She had nowhere to go but up. The fireworks still exploding, the bells still ringing, she started to mount the stairs. Her tormentor was not coming in immediate pursuit, she saw. Julia's appeals for help had diverted him to where she lay, halfway between the stairs and the front door. He drew the knife from her side. She cried out in pain, and, as if to assist her, he went down on his haunches beside her body. She raised her arm to him, looking for tenderness. In response, he cupped his hand beneath her head and drew her up toward him. As their faces came within inches of each other, Julia seemed to realize that Frank's intentions were far from honorable. She opened her mouth to scream, but he sealed her lips with his and began to feed. She kicked and scratched at the air, all in vain. Tearing her eyes from the sight of this depravity, Kirsty crawled up to the head of the stairs. The second floor offered no real hiding place, of course, nor was there any escape route except to leap from one of the windows. But having seen the cold comfort that Frank had offered his mistress, jumping was clearly the preferable option. The fall might break every bone in her body, but it would at least deprive the monster of further sustenance. The fireworks were fizzling out, it seemed. The landing was in smoky darkness. She stumbled along it rather than walked, her fingertips moving along the wall. Downstairs she heard Frank on the move again. He was finished with Julia. Now he spoke as he began up the stairs, that same incestuous invitation. Come to Daddy. It occurred to her that the Cenobites were probably viewing this chase with no little amusement, and would not act until there was only one player left, Frank. She was forfeit to their pleasure. Bastards, she breathed, and hoped they heard. She had almost reached the end of the landing. Ahead lay the junk room. Did it have a window sizable enough for her to climb through? If so, she would jump and curse them as she fell, curse them all, God and the devil and whatever lay between, curse them as she dropped, hope for nothing but that the concrete be quick with her. Frank was calling her again, and almost at the top of the stairs. She turned the key in the lock, opened the junk room door, and slipped through. Yes, there was a window. It was uncurtained, and moonlight fell through it in shafts of indecent beauty, illuminating a chaos of furniture and boxes. She made her way through the confusion to the window. It was wedged open an inch or two to air the room. She put her fingers under the frame and tried to heave it up far enough for her to climb out, but the sash in the window had rotted, and her arms were not quite equal to the task. She quickly hunted for a makeshift lever, part of her mind coolly calculating the number of steps it would take her pursuer to cover the length of the landing. Less than 20, she concluded, as she pulled the sheet off of one of the tea chests, only to find a dead man staring up at her from the chests, eyes wild. He was broken in a dozen places, arms smashed and bent upon themselves, legs tucked up into his chin. As she went to cry out, she heard Frank at the door. "Where are you?" he inquired. She clamped her hand over her face to stop the cry of revulsion from coming. As she did so, the door handle turned. She ducked out of sight behind a felled armchair, swallowing her scream. The door opened. She heard Frank's breath, slightly labored, heard the hollow pad of his feet on the boards, then the sound of the door being pulled again. Then the sound of the door being pulled to again. It clicked. Silence. She waited for a count of 13, then peeped out of hiding, half expecting him to still be in the room with her, waiting for her to break cover. But no, he'd gone. Swallowing the breath her cry had been mounting upon brought an unwelcome side effect. Hiccups. The first of them, so unexpected she had no time to subdue it, sounded gun-crack loud, but there was no returning step from the landing. Frank, it seemed, was already out of earshot. As she returned to the window skirting the tea-chest coffin, a second hiccup startled her. She silently reprimanded her belly, but in vain. A third and a fourth came unbidden while she wrestled once more to lift the window. That, too, was a fruitless effort. It had no intention of compliance. Briefly, she contemplated breaking the glass and yelling for help, but rapidly discarded the idea. Frank would be eating out her eyes before the neighbors had even shaken off sleep. Instead, she retraced her steps to the door and opened it a creaking fashion. There was no sign of Frank so far as her eyes were able to interpret the shadows. So cautiously, she opened the door a little wider and stepped onto the landing once again. The gloom was like a living thing, smothered her in murky kisses. She advanced 3 paces without incident, then a 4th. On the 5th, her lucky number, her body took a turn for the suicidal. She hiccuped again, her hand too tardy to reach her mouth before the din was out. And this time, it did not go unheard. "There you are," said a shadow, and Frank slipped from the bedroom to block her path. He was faster for his meal. He seemed as wide as the landing, and he stank of meat. With nothing to lose, she screamed blue murder as he came at her. He was unashamed by her terror. With inches between her flesh and his knife, she threw herself sideways and found that the 5th step had brought her abreast of Frank's room. She stumbled through the door. He was after her in a flash, crowing his delight. There was a window in this room, she knew. She'd broken it herself mere hours before. But the darkness was so profound she might have been blindfolded, not even a glimmer of moonlight to feed her sight. Frank was equally lost, it seemed. He called after her in this pitch, the whine of his knife accompanying his call as he slit the air, back and forth, back and forth. Stepping away from the sound, her foot caught on the tangle of the bandaging on the floor. The next moment she was toppling. It wasn't the boards that she fell heavily upon, however, but the greasy bulk of Rory's corpse. It won a howl of horror from her. "There you are," said Frank. The knife slices were suddenly closer, inches from her head, but she was deaf to them. She had her arms around his body beneath her and approaching death was nothing beside the pain she felt now, touching him. "Rory," she moaned, content that his name be on her lips when the cut came. "That's right," Frank said. "Rory." Somehow the theft of Rory's name was as unforgivable as stealing his skin, or so her grief told her. A skin was nothing. Pigs had skin. Snakes had skin. They were knitted of dead cells, shed and grown. They were knitted of dead cells, shed and grown, and shed again. But a name? That was a spell which summoned memories. She would not let Frank usurp it. "Rory's dead," she said. The words stung her, and with the sting, the ghost of a thought. "Hush, baby," he told her. Suppose the Cenobites were waiting for Frank to name himself. Hadn't the visitor in the hospital said something about Frank confessing? "You're not Rory," she said. "We know that," came the reply, "but nobody else does." Well, who are you, then? Poor baby. Losing your mind, are you? Good thing, too. Who, though? It's safer that way. Who? Hush, baby, he said. He was stooping to her in the darkness, his face within inches of hers. Everything's going to be right as rain. Yes, yes. Frank's here, baby. Frank? That's right. I'm Frank. So saying, he delivered the killing blow, but she heard it coming in the darkness and dodged its benediction. A second later, the bell began again, and the bare bulb in the middle of the room flickered into life. By it she saw Frank beside his brother, the knife buried in the dead man's buttock. As he worked it out of the wound, he set his eyes on her afresh. Another chime, and he was up, and would have been at her but for the voice. It said his name, lightly, as if calling a child to play. Frank. His face dropped for the second time that night. A look of puzzlement flitted across it, and on its heels, horror. Slowly he turned his head round to look at the speaker. It was the Cenobite, its hooks sparkling. Behind it, Kirsty saw 3 other figures, their anatomies catalogues of disfigurement. Frank threw a glance back at Kirsty. You did this, he said. She nodded. Get out of here, said one of the newcomers. This isn't your business now. Whore! Frank screeched at her. Bitch! Cheating fucking bitch! The hail of rage followed her across the room and to the door. As her palm closed around the door handle, she heard him coming after her and turned to find that he was standing less than a foot from her, the knife a hair's breadth from her body. But there he was fixed, unable to advance even another millimeter. They had their hooks in him, the flesh of his arms and legs, and curled through the meat of his face. Attached to the hooks, chains which they held taut. There was a soft sound, and his resistance drew the barbs through his muscle. His mouth was dragged wide, his neck and chest plowed open. The knife dropped from his fingers. He expelled a last incoherent curse at her, his body shuddering now as he lost his battle with their claim upon him. Inch by inch he was drawn back toward the middle of the room. Go, said the voice of the Cenobite. She could see them no longer. They were already lost behind the blood-flecked air. Accepting their invitation, she opened the door, while behind her Frank began to scream. As she stepped onto the landing, plaster dust cascaded from the ceiling. The house was growling from basement to eaves. She had to go quickly, she knew, before whatever demons were loose here shook the place apart. But though time was short, she could not prevent herself from snatching one look at Frank, to be certain that he would... She could not prevent herself from snatching a look at Frank to be certain that he would come after her no longer. He was in extremis, hooked through in a dozen or more places, fresh wounds gouged at him even as she watched. Spread-eagled beneath the solitary body hauled to the limits of its endurance and beyond, he gave vent to shrieks that would have worn pity from her had she not learned better. Suddenly his cries stopped. There was a pause, and then, in one last act of defiance, he cranked up his heavy head and stared at her, meeting her gaze with eyes from which all bafflement and all malice had fled. They glittered as they rested on her, pearls in awful. In response, the chains were drawn an inch tighter, but the Cenobites gained no further cry from him. Instead, he put his tongue out at Kirsty and flicked it back and forth across his teeth in a gesture of unrepentant lewdness. Then he came unsown. His limbs separated from his torso and his head from his shoulders in a welter of bone shards and heat. She threw the door closed as something thudded against it from the other side. His head, she guessed. Then she was staggering downstairs, wolves in the house, with wolves howling in the walls and the bells in turmoil everywhere, thickening the air like smoke, the ghosts of wounded birds, sewn wingtip to wingtip and lost to flight. She reached the bottom of the stairs and began along the hallway to the front door, but as she came within spitting distance of freedom, she heard somebody call her name. It was Julia. There was blood on the hall floor, marking a trail from the spot where Frank had abandoned her through into the dining room. "Kirsty," she called again. It was a pitiable sound, and despite the wing-choked air, she could not help but go in pursuit of it, stepping through into the dining room. The furniture was smoldering charcoal. The ash that she glimpsed was a foul-smelling carpet, and there, in the middle of the domestic wasteland, sat a bride. By some extraordinary act of will, Julia had managed to put her wedding dress on and secure her veil upon her head. Now she sat in the dirt, the dress besmirched, but she looked radiant nevertheless, more beautiful indeed for the fact of the ruin surrounding her. "Help me," she said, and only now did Kirsty realize that the voice she heard was not coming from beneath the lush veil, but from the bride's lap. And now the copious folds of the dress were parting, and there was Julia's head, set on a pillow of scarlet silk and framed with a fall of auburn hair. Bereft of lungs, how could it speak? It spoke nevertheless. "Kirsty," it said it begged and sighed and rolled back and forth in the bride's lap as if it hoped to enlarge its reason. Kirsty might have aided it, might have snatched the head up and dashed out its brains, but that the bride's veil had started to twitch and was rising now as if plucked at by invisible fingers. Beneath it a light flickered and grew brighter, and brighter yet, and with the light, a voice. "I am the engineer," it sighed. No more than that. Then the fluted folds rose higher, and the head beneath gained the brilliance of a minor sun. She did not wait for that blaze to blind her. Instead, she backed out into the hallway, the birds almost gone now, the wolves insane. The birds almost solid now, the wolves insane, and flung herself at the front door, even as the hallway ceiling began to give way. The night came to meet her. Finally, a clean darkness. She breathed it in greedy gulps as she departed the house at a run. It was her second such departure. God help her sanity, that there ever be a third. At the corner of Lodovico Street she looked back. The house had not capitulated to the forces unleashed within. It stood now, quiet as a grave. No, quieter. As she turned away, somebody collided with her. She yelped with surprise, but the huddled pedestrian was already hurrying away and into the anxious murk that preceded morning. As the figure hovered on the outskirts of solidity, it glanced back, and its head flared in the gloom, a cone of white fire. It was the engineer. She had no time to look away. It was gone again in a single instant, leaving its glamour in her eye. Only then did she realize the purpose of the collision. Le Marchand's box had been passed back to her and sat in her hand. Its surfaces had been immaculately resealed and polished to a high gloss. Though she did not examine it, she was certain there would be no clue as to its solution left. The next discoverer would voyage its faces without a chart. And until such time, was she elected its keeper? Apparently so. She turned it over in her hand. For the frailest of moments, she seemed to see the ghosts in the lacquer, Julia's face and that of Frank. She turned it over again, looking to see if Rory was held here, but no. Wherever he was, it wasn't here. There were other puzzles, perhaps, that if solved gave access to the place where he lodged. A crossword, maybe, whose solutions would lift the latch of Paradise Garden, or a jigsaw in the completion of which lay access to Wonderland. She would wait and watch as she had always waited. She would wait and watch as she had always watched and waited, hoping that such a puzzle would one day come to her. But if it failed to show itself, she would not grieve too deeply for fear that the mending of broken hearts be a puzzle neither wit nor time had the skill to solve. And so ends tonight's terrible testimonial. The Hellbound Heart is, of course, the basis of the Hellraiser films. If you haven't seen them, you owe yourself a watch of the first 3 at least. Most enthusiastic thanks to the brilliant Mr. Barker. Stay scary, wildlings. Take some time to appreciate the pleasures of a good fright, and make the most of your nights.